Hi, this is Buck the Dagger.
Hello, my name is Tanja the Rose.
And this is the Dagger and the Rose podcast.
He and she conversations.
All right, we made it. Episode 1.
Yay.
The Dagger and the Rose. And we're doing it on a very important day. 11/11. Veterans Day. That's kind of a double meaning for us, but very important as far as our background. So you have some experience with military too. You're a military family, right?
Yeah. My dad's retired military, so I always appreciate the veterans that have served for our country. And you also have your experience with that as well.
Yeah. I've been working with special operations with the Department of Defense for the military for 4 years. Working with operators, people who are the tip of the spear. Some of them have seen combat, some of them have not. But being in that world and seeing, something really powerful when you and I went to Paris, which we're going to get to. We had a whole adventure in Paris.
Yeah, many adventures.
It's a big adventure in Paris. France in general. Mm-hmm. But we got a chance to go to Normandy, and being on the beaches of Normandy and being in the spot where one of the most horrific battles that have ever taken place occurred, and just putting it in frame of reference, like the soldiers that the sons that we lost, the sons that were sacrificed for the sake of worldwide freedom. I think that was one of the reasons I think it was important for me to do this on 11/11, because I've had the honor of working with men at the tip of that spear for 4 years.
Yeah.
Somehow my martial arts career as a fighter, as a mixed martial arts fighter and a Muay Thai fighter, professional fighter, champion at some point, parlayed into a career path working with people who are fighting for real, people who are fighting for freedom in the world, which is true honor. So, and you spoke about this because when we were there, when we were in Normandy and we got a chance to see one of the monuments, we noticed a picture.
Yeah. It spoke to my heart. One of the things that spoke to my heart is when you were doing a podcast, a rainbow appeared.
Right.
And to me, that was just such a symbolic blessing of the work that we want to do and just this, like the rainbow after the rain, and the symbolism of rainbow means new beginnings, new hope. But one of the things that deeply moved me and touched me the most, that I thought was the most profound, is when we were there was an image. And it really penetrated my heart, because in this image, you have this picture of these men going to war. And in that moment, they were looking at letters that their loved ones had written them. And why that spoke to me so much is it made me realize that, like, even during that time of war, love was present. And they were connected to their loved ones. And it just meant so much that, like, even at this horrific time, that love was present. And I want to believe that, like always, that even in times of war, love is present. And it was just really this powerful transmission of, like, the loved ones running to them, and you have these, like, warriors and these soldiers, but this archetype of, like, the nurturer and the lover and the beloved, like, cherished them and sent them with these, like, blessings and these well-wishings and this honoring. And that was really, like, the picture that, like, really moved me and touched me the most. And I guess I could just relate myself, like, from the feminine aspect of, like, supporting someone going into that state. and sharing like a piece of your heart with that, like just moved me a lot. So I think that was like a part that really spoke to me the most.
I really appreciate hearing that. I don't think people think about love being a driver in war. When we think about the horrific aspects of it, but I always imagine, like, especially after seeing that picture, and if you haven't seen the picture, we'll try to post it in the show notes. Essentially, a bunch of these men are clumped together, and we're not sure if they're actually on the beaches of Normandy right before everything starts. You're not really sure. You don't get a whole lot of context, but you know they're all piled together, and and some of them are looking at notes. Others don't have them, which also tells a story. Like these were men that may or may not have had any type of support, or their support didn't show up. You got to talk. We're talking about before Instagram, before social media, or even email.
Yeah.
These people are getting paper mail and waiting, and sometimes they get them, and sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
And so you could see the despair on the guys that didn't get them, and then you saw the hope on the guys that got a letter.
Yeah.
And you know, we're talking about people that were going to go fight. And there was no guarantee they were going to make it out. As a matter of fact, the numbers, there was 10,000, a little over 10,000 people sent. Over seven, which were Americans. And we lost over 50% of the people that went there.
Yeah.
I mean, you were a flip of a coin of surviving. And a lot of these people went and died for something they were never going to see. They were never going to see the freedom that their beloved would have, their sons, their daughters would have, but they were willing to do that because they loved those people so much they would rather die than let them live in a world that wasn't free. And for them to have the power to go pretty much sacrifice themselves because there was so much love back home, I think that's something that can't be understated. And you brought this up talking about the 300 movie. When we were having conversations, just both of us shared this as one of our favorite movies of all time. So you saw, what did you see in the 300 that brought this to mind?
What brought it to mind is like when you look at the movie 300, which is one of my favorite all-time movies, and I've always loved this archetype of the warrior king. And my favorite scene in the movie is when he is walking this messenger to this pit. And he's debating whether or not he's going to go to war. And in the scene, he takes in all the, we call the yin energy, the feminine energy. So right before he declares war, he looks at the children, the young girls and the young boys. He looks at the elderly, the disabled. He looks to the women, and then he looks to his wife. And then she nods her head, and then they declare war. And to me, that is the difference between, like, and you might touch a little bit more upon this, like a true warrior versus a tyrant. Because he wasn't like hot-headed, and he was like this strong, muscular, like warrior king, but he wasn't hot-headed. He literally like took in all that energy and very auto-regulated like his emotion. And he was very passionate when he kicked him in the pit. But before he did that, he took in his tribe. He took in his people. He felt the weight of that responsibility, and he connected with his wife and that feminine energy. And she was on board, and they were connected. Then he declared war. And to me, it archetypically really showed like the true essence of like this warrior king. That it isn't like going to war just to spill blood. It's just not about him like off with their heads and bloodshed. Like there's something greater than himself, and protecting those people he loved and setting that example that motivates his declaration of war at that moment. And to me, that's one of the ultimate love stories I've ever seen. Just the love of someone that would make tremendous sacrifices and for the sake of like protection of his people and his tribe and his queen, and to take all that in. And I think often when we think of these warrior archetypes, we think of the quote unquote proverbial tyrant. And I think that's a difference between like the warrior and the tyrant. Like the tyrant only thinks of himself.
Mm-hmm.
In like, what can I gain or what can I get?
Yeah. It's an ego-driven pursuit.
And versus the warrior thinks of something outside of himself. And one of the interesting things that we spoke of when I asked you is like, what's the difference between even a fighter versus a warrior? And if you want to talk about that, I thought that was really enlightening.
Yeah, I think first off, I look at them as levels of progression, not necessarily one is better than the other. You start where you're at. I started as a fighter. I fought in a ring, in a cage, on a mat for several decades. And when I wasn't doing that, I was training people to fight in those same arenas. And people talk about sport combat. It's, of course it's sport, but sport combat is the only sport you don't play.
Tell us more about that.
Yeah. I mean, you play football, you play basketball, you play every other sport. You don't play fighting, you fight. The sport of fighting is simulated death. And the understanding that like your nervous system doesn't know the difference between a simulated situation and a real one. When you step into a cage and you hear that door clang close, you are fighting for your life, or at least a part of you is doing that. There's no playing going on at that point. Sure, there's the pageantry that comes on before that, people talking trash and trying to build up ticket sales. But when the bell rings and that door closes, it's two human beings fighting. And every sport knows this innately, even though they claim that they are, the apex predators on the planet. Every sport devolves into fighting at some point. Two guys on the line of football get into it, they turn into a fight. Baseball, somebody hits somebody with a 90-mile-an-hour ball because that simulates someone throwing a rock at them trying to kill them. They charge at each other and they try to fight. I have never seen a mixed martial arts fight devolve into a basketball match. Not once. Nobody just started playing baseball when two guys like disagreed in the cage, like fighting is the purest form of sport, and all sport is some derivative of combat, right? It's a simulation of that, from being able to swing a bat, to throw a rock, to throw a ball, to hit somebody with armor on. It's all simulated combat, but then combat is combat. Mixed martial arts is combat. Is a one-on-one combat. In any event, even in that, they're fighters. They're not warriors yet. There's a couple of warriors that come into it, but they're fighters. And a fighter is a person who is in competition with other people, but he's really in competition with himself. He is a person that's trying to build his own identity and ego through struggle. So it doesn't matter whether he's fighting in a cage or a ring or whatever. If he is going to become a person working with metal or working at the shipyards or dockyards, at some point he's got to go fight and resist against the world in order to build an identity, to become something. He's got to gain resources. He's got to gain confidence. He's got to have stories to tell, wisdom to share, so that at some point he can lead someone, he can be with a woman, he can create a life, because he doesn't have an identity yet. So the fighting stage of every young man, so I can speak to young men because I've been coaching men for several decades now. The fighting stage is necessary. You have to go become somebody. The difference is once you reach a certain level of maturity and you're ready to move to the next level, a warrior fights for a cause, fights for something outside of himself. At this point, you have developed a set of values, core beliefs that are bigger than you as the individual. There's something that's big enough that you would be willing to die for, like the men on the beach in Normandy. Like, even though they were afraid and they were scared, they had core beliefs and values about family and country and duty and honor that were bigger than their life. And they were willing to go out there and sacrifice themselves for that. A warrior fights for a cause, something greater and bigger than them. And at some point, a man has to graduate to that in order to become a man, because staying in the fighter stage keeps you a boy. A kid is always trying to develop themselves, find themselves. Who am I? Who am I in relation to everyone else? It's an important stage, but at some point you got to decide who you are. You got to decide what your stamp is going to be on the world. And then you have to implement that onto the world. And you have to find people who are in alignment with that part of you. And if you don't find that, then unfortunately what ends up happening is men end up in relationships where they are boats without oars, boats without steers, boats without any type of direction. They're going to be pulled by the tide. And they might find themselves in relationships, whether it be romantic or business wise, where they are being carried and pulled by someone else. And they become the victim of someone else's narrative and story. And they will clearly blame it on the other people, that they are always getting bad partners. There's no good women out here. Every guy out there is out to get me. There must be something going on in the world that says that it's unfair for me to get what I want. And I always tell guys, is like, if you are the common denominator, something is probably you. Mm-hmm. If they keep showing up in your life, it's probably something that you're putting out there. And most likely you don't have enough core values and beliefs that you've defined clearly enough through your fighting years.
Yeah.
Because your fighting years, you should have determined this to be solid or not. You haven't determined that. So if you show up to a situation and you don't have clear values, you're going to go with the tide.
Yeah.
And then that's on you.
Mm-hmm.
It's a Stoic philosophy. I don't have any control over what anybody else does. I have every control over what I do and how I perceive a situation. And that is ultimately, I think, what a warrior becomes, which is why the whole focus of what I do is the warrior and the gentleman, right? And we'll get to the gentleman part shortly.
Yeah.
That makes sense?
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
Was there a pivotal moment that you went from the fighter to the warrior?
There's a couple of them. I think for most people, it happens in stages.
Mm-hmm.
It happens more drastically, I think, when people are intentional. But I think I remember the moment after my last professional fight. I got trained so hard for that fight. I went to go fight the boogeyman at the time. It's written in my book. This guy named Taylor Dixon out of DC was the baddest guy on the planet as far as I was concerned. Mm-hmm. And every part of my identity was like, I have to beat that man in order to prove who I am. Mm-hmm. And I sacrificed a lot to go beat that guy. And it was interesting. When you make the boogeyman a super being, mm-hmm. and then you finally meet him and you realize he's just a man, mm-hmm. your victory is more shallow than you thought it would be. Mm-hmm. And I think that was the key moment. I remember beating him, and I remember raising my hand and looking up to the lights and hearing the cheers and the roar, and I didn't hear anything. It went deaf silent. Mm-hmm. And I remember looking up and going, this is it? Yeah. This is what I suffered over. This is what I needed to do to prove to myself that somehow I was worthy, was to go beat this man. And I thought it was going to feel more than that. Yeah. And it felt more like relief. Mm. It felt more like relief of not losing than it did about joy of winning. Mm. And I realized, like, at some point you got to decide who you are outside of all this fighting. And I think that's where the shift started to occur for me. But that was back in 2001. Mm-hmm. And of course there's bumps along the road that you start making that shift and you're like, oh, everything's fine and dandy. And you realize, oh, this is a road I haven't driven down. This thing has rocks all over it. And I'm driving in a Subaru. You know? I don't have a 4x4. I'm not ready for this. This is going to be hard. And then you're on that hard road. You want to go back to the road you're comfortable with, right? You want to go back to the road that you're more familiar with, but you know you can't go back. It's like mm-hmm. the code of the Matrix has been revealed to you now. Yeah. You know that going back there will be easy, but it's not the way. You can't be a fighter for the rest of your life. You got to fight for something bigger than that if you want to become a more well-developed man. And that was my transition into that. So, and I think that always like colors our coaching, right? So you coach women, yeah. right? Yeah. You're coming off of this Paris situation. Mm-hmm. Like we went to Paris and France and had this great experience. You had a speech, you were given this award. Like let's talk about that, because that was an adventure.
It was. It was. I love Paris. Paris always speaks to my heart. Just the beauty and the culture and the food and just the hospitality. Mm. It's just, they are really the most hospitable, nicest people I've ever met. And Paris has always called to me. Mm. And the first time I went to Paris, I was invited to Paris Fashion Week by a fashion designer. And she invited women that represented the soul of beauty, not just the third dimensional soul of beauty.
Okay.
And that was the first time I got this like download and this gnosis of, I truly believe that women are the jewels in the crown of humanity. And to me, that speaks to like, you can't say that a diamond is more beautiful than a sapphire, is more beautiful than a ruby or an emerald, that we all have our innate beauty. And I think beauty inspires the world.
Mm.
And I think beauty is a tremendous healer. And as time went on, the second part of that is I believe that men are the precious metals that hold that crown.
Mm.
And there's this like beautiful union with the masculine and the feminine. And I also believe that like the masculine represents more like this precious metals that you see, like in the dagger, there's always that rose or that sword or that is like forged in the fire or that tool that builds the world.
Mm.
Like men essentially built the world for us at one point. And for thousands of years and even hundreds of years, you see the pictures of the men building the skyscrapers of New York, and they're on these little cranes.
Oh my God, yeah. Love those pictures.
Yeah. They built this beautiful world for us. So it's also honoring like the masculine. And again, there's some warriors and there's some tyrants, and we can't categorize one bad apple for like the beauty of the masculine as well.
Mm.
So that was my first time in Paris. So that was always been my calling in helping women really step into more their deeper levels of beauty and not being afraid to stand in their beauty or their true beauty essence because they're afraid that might mean that they're a target, or that might mean that it makes other people jealous or envious or hatred or in competition, and really looking at it as an emanation of like healing into the world. So at that time, I had opened a company called Majestic Beauty, where I would help women transform from the inside and outside, which I think was one facet of it.
Sure.
And then over time, I started more of a company that also realized there were a lot of wounds around women and receiving, especially in the financial aspect.
Mm.
So I started coaching and teaching around not only like love and relationships, being, a certified sex, love, and relationship coach, but also healing a lot of aspects around the wounding around money.
Mm-hmm.
And really all of it boils down to like receivership and being able to receive the abundance and what goes with that. So that started me on a different journey,
Mm-hmm.
which led me to Paris and led me to receiving this Legendary Woman of Impact Award, which also led me on a billboard in Times Square. So it was fun, going from Paris to New York.
Had a couple of really cool weekends where we went from 10 days in France,
and
Monaco. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
Normandy, from there back to Paris,
Mm-hmm.
getting on the plane, come back home, and then right back to New York to see the billboard. It was some pretty exciting couple of weeks there.
And one of the things that I realized is that we all have these stories that we've been told since we were young. And I think this inherently affects both men and women, but I speak more towards women. And that is through the basis of fairy tales. And the underlying premise on a lot of fairy tales is that we have to be in lack or deficit in order to have our happily ever after. So, for example, my upcoming workshop on the Cinderella Scandal, it's like you have to be the servant girl scrubbing and in deficit, and you were born of abundance, but you're now poverty stricken.
Right.
In order to be rescued from your everyday life by this man who is supposedly like the perfect match. But nobody ever stops to say like, okay, Prince Charming perhaps has a castle or whatever, but he's not wise by any means.
Mm.
I mean, this man doesn't recognize her without makeup on, doesn't recognize her by the sound of her voice.
Yeah.
Needs like this external source of the soul in order to recognize her. So it's like, I firmly believe that in that context, he wasn't pursuing her. He was on this quest to pursue this idea of her because he needed her true soul and didn't know her by heart and soul. And I really believe that in order to be in right partnership, you have to have vision. And those with, the Bible says those without vision shall perish. But even if you're not extremely biblical, it's like you have to see where you're going. You have to have vision.
Mm.
And you have to be able to go in a certain direction. And this man had no vision. Like, he couldn't even recognize her.
Yeah, like literally no physical vision if you couldn't
recognize her. He might as well have had a seeing eye dog.
Yeah. We'll post in the notes. We found a really awesome picture of Prince Charming with Cinderella and him being blind and having a seeing eye dog.
Yeah. And so I think one of the things that we are taught, right, is like, this person looks good on paper, but then they have no vision for who you are at soul level. They don't know the real you. Perhaps it's a projection of you, and they're not leading you in a certain direction, which ultimately I feel like it's a very dangerous thing to be with or one of the most dangerous things you can do is be with an indecisive man that is leading you nowhere.
Yeah.
So this man, you're pair bonded to him. He's on the fence. He can never make a decision. He's wishy-washy. He's like, well, we'll see where it goes, or I'm not sure. And then there's never any momentum. You never go anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think it is a much wiser decision to be with a man that can make a decision.
Yeah. Yeah.
Period. He can make a decision.
Period.
Yeah.
Even if it's the wrong decision.
Even if it's the wrong decision. Yes. Because if you're with someone that is capable of making a decision, you also have to trust, if you pick the right partner, based off that data, he can course correct that decision.
100%.
So he has enough knowledge, enough resources to say,
or he's resourceful.
Yeah. Hey, this wasn't the best decision.
Mm-hmm.
I realize that. Let me course correct.
Yeah.
I think that's a much healthier relationship, because at least he is working to move the relationship or you in a direction, versus just this indecisive wishy-washiness, like, we'll see where it goes and we'll see what happens in life. And it's just like, there's never any direction. Yeah. And then you're just kind of in the sidelines trying to figure it out. Or then you start making these assumptions, right? Cinderella Scandal. It's like, oh, well, maybe he means this. Let me fill in the gaps.
Mm-hmm.
So you start filling in these gaps of what you think he means. But he doesn't even.
Right. This is really important. I'm so glad you're bringing this up, because what I'm hearing is that men who come into a relationship without direction end up being this man.
Mm-hmm.
And as I spoke before, there's the fighting age of a man where the whole point of him fighting is to find out who he is and where he's going, and to show up in every relationship and every situation with direction.
Mm-hmm.
And his real job is not to coerce another woman into bed with him. It's to find whatever woman is going to be on his path, because he has a clear one.
Yeah.
Right. If he comes into a relationship with a clear path, she's going to feel safe enough to submit or give herself to him.
Mm-hmm.
And if she trusts him enough, again, if he makes mistakes, he'll course correct. But he's not the guy that, like, we're talking the military, being on the X, right? Being on the X is the worst place you can be. X marks the spot. That's where all the artillery fire. That's where you're basically dead to rights if you stay right here. You don't freeze on the X, right? When situations occur in a relationship, you got to make a move. Even a move in the wrong direction is better than just sitting here and waiting for the world to happen, right? You are better with motion and movement. So if you move and you course correct, we know this in fighting, you stay still, you're going to get hit regardless.
Yeah.
At least if you're moving, you got a chance. And if you get hit while you're moving, you can roll with the punch, you can get back on mission, but nothing never happens from freezing. But people don't freeze when they know what their path and their course is.
Yeah.
So, like, where do you think this is? Where do we think we bump heads? Because I hear you saying this and I hear me saying this about guys, but then now somehow you have the women that can't find the good guy, and I have the guys that can't find the good woman.
Well, because I think the programming is like, find the different person, right? Like, find the the proverbial, like, Prince Charming. Oh, like, he has the castle and he has the shoe, and oh, he's just right. And
or the 666 guy you talked about in Paris.
Guy.
This is a good one. You guys know the 666 guy? She's going to tell you.
So if you don't hire like an actual dating coach, like the proverbial 666 guy. So it's like, oh, he has to be at least 6 foot. He has to make at least 6 figures or more, or he has to be like 6 inches or greater. But I also say, like, 666, are you calling in the devil, or is this really the right guy?
Right.
So you have to be really careful, because this is like the criteria that what men are looking for, and it's not always the right criteria.
that women are looking for.
Because they're told that's like the ultimate prize of like masculinity. But is just because somebody has that criteria doesn't necessarily make him a good partner or a good leader. Does he even really know you on a heart and soul level? Is he pouring into you? Is there a connection? And does he have a desire to lead you somewhere? I think are really important things to look at. So for me, that's part of that Cinderella scandal, is just like partnership or picking. Part of it too is, I think, as women, especially high achieving women, which are typically the women that I work with, is we are taught that we have to constantly be in lack or constantly be in deficit in order to receive our happily ever after. So if we just work harder, if we just push harder, if we just grind harder, if we just work to the point of exhaustion, if we just get that one more degree, if we just get that one more certificate, if we just work those extra hours, if we just starve ourselves even more, if we just more and push ourselves to that point of deficit, then eventually we'll get our happily ever after. And I really disagree with that narrative.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I truly believe that as women, we have to receive in order to get back more. So if you're running on zero energy, there's nothing to give. Like that's when, exhaustion or depression or autoimmune diseases or other things happen in our life where we create these physical things because our cortisol levels are up, we're under more stress, we're not in our pleasure, we don't know how to receive because we haven't been taught that. So this is all discussed in the masterclass of the Cinderella Scandal, which will lead into a 6-week conscious queen course, which will go into many fairy tale princesses. One of them, as we talked about, is Cinderella. We'll also talk about, Sleeping Beauty and just being unconscious and how we've taught we have to be in a coma or unconscious in order to have our happily ever after. We've got Belle, who's held prisoner in the imprisonment of perfection, that we'll talk about. We have Snow White in the wound of betrayal. So there'll be many, different archetypes and wounds that will heal through these stories and narratives that we were taught as little girls. So I'm excited. I think it'll be a very transformative journey, and it's a journey that's very unique because it will help transform and heal both love and money wounds and create remedies.
Oh, that's beautiful. It's great because, relationships are not a zero-sum game. Like I think the modern day person treats it like you got the red pill movement for guys and you have the ultra liberal feminist movement. Both of them are treating relationships like a zero-sum game. And if you're not familiar with the term zero-sum is like war, like fighting. Anything that's good for me is bad for you. You treat it like a game you have to win. Yeah. Right? Whereas, I like to think about a relationship being like a game of catch. Like the purpose in catch is not to win. The purpose is to continue to play the game. Yeah, we want to continue playing the game back and forth on the table with one another. And something that I learned from us working together with your work, especially because my focus is on men. I focus on developing warrior gentlemen, taking people from being this unconscious fighter in their life to having like some intent and purpose, right? Showing up with a sense of class and dignity while still being a savage, right? And having some purpose and something willing to claw and fight for. But I noticed from hearing your stories that since this is not a zero-sum game, this is a collaborative game, the pains that you have as women directly reflect the pains that we're having as men. Yeah. Because you and I talked about the white knight thing. Yeah. Right? Like, what are some things that when you speak about the white knight, we already talked about Prince Charming, right? Which I've always hated Prince Charming. Like I thought I had some choice words about that man growing up, like that I will not share right here. But like what do you see as a correlation to that?
I think the correlation for men, for women, it's like there's this message that if I'm full, if I don't need to be rescued, then I'll never have my happily ever after. So you're running this program of deficit where you'll get money and then hold on to it and then lose it. or something great will happen, that you're not taught, like, how good do you want to have it? How good are you willing to receive it? So, and then all these childhood stories are like, oh, well, you have to be in deficit. So I think as women, the subconscious programming is deficit equals happily ever after, versus that's not real love. Like I said, love is not subtraction or division. Even when you're in a healthy relationship, it shouldn't take away from you. You shouldn't have to divide pieces of yourself in order to be with it. Healthy relationship is going to be about addition and multiplication. You're going to add value to each other's life. It's going to be a win-win. And then you're going to take whatever's fruitful and multiply. And that is the true definition of a healthy, happy relationship. I feel how this affects men is you have the proverbial and white knight who will pick these women who aren't healthy partners because they want to be their hero. And they're programmed to be the hero. Yes. And so in order to be the hero, then they can't be with a healthy partner, because then they can't be the hero, even though they could be the hero to her. Sure. But that's not his programming.
No, like her staying a victim reaffirms his identity as the white knight. By definition, if she heals, then he can no longer be his identity. So that's going to be in question. So he's got to find someone who stays in the state of rescue. Right. So I understand that.
Yeah. So, it's okay to be the white knight, but maybe, I prefer more of the archetype of the warrior king, which is what we're talking about. Him and the queen had a very potent relationship, but they were both in their own rightfulness and power, and then together could multiply and add value to each other's life. But that's not the narrative that we're taught. We're taught very much the victim and the rescuer, right? Archetype, which, it's a very potent narrative. So I think a lot of it is healing that. Yeah, and I think that's where probably a lot of men suffer. They're like, okay, and then they end up with women they have to chronically rescue in order to fill that need.
It's very interesting because as a kid growing up, all the fairy tale stories that you talk about, like every guy I know knew the stories on the periphery, but no one ever watched them. Like I can't tell you, I have never watched Cinderella from beginning to end. But I know everything about Cinderella.
Yeah.
I know everything about Cinderella because I know who I'm supposed to become in order to get like that princess or queen or whatever, right? Like, that, okay, to even be in the ball game, I got to go be like the rich dude with the castle that looks the part, that does the thing, that has all the resources, that signals all the things out into the world. So I already know I got to go fight and struggle for that just to get into the game. And then I'm taught that once I get into the game and I signal all these things to you, I win. I don't really have to know you. I don't have to know anything about you. I don't have to have any expression to you. You don't have to know my pains. You just need to know that I have the things. I got to fit the part, because every story is basically said, if I fit the part, then you're going to find a way to fit yourself into my life. And then we're going to live happily ever after, which means you're basically looking for a person who is looking to be rescued, and you reaffirm yourself every single day. And it doesn't even have to be, I know what guys is like, it doesn't even have to be like you come in financially rescue them, although that's a big drive.
Yeah.
Some of the higher successful men that I know that are like, that I've coached, who have the money, have the resources, are still miserable because they thought that by definition of fairy tale, if I get all the money, the girls are just going to be flocking to you. I'm like, yeah, all the girls that look at you for your money, they're going to flock to you, but they're not going to be partners. And if you lead with the money, you're just feeding into that same narrative of people that want you for your resources, which they will leave you for better resources. So you're still playing that story. And now it's interesting because we're both think that we're on other sides of the game fighting each other, but we're both miserable because of the stories we were both told.
Yeah.
Which seems to me like we're more allies than we are enemies.
Yeah. And that was, the desire to do this podcast is really at the soul level. I like to believe that the future is unity. And unity, there has to be differences for there to be unity. Unity is not uniformity. Like if you look at a forest or an ecosystem, it's biodiverse. And the more biodiverse it is, the more thriving the ecosystem.
Mm.
You know, if you have one virus that takes out one tree and they're all the same tree, well, then you no longer have a forest.
True. Yeah.
So there's safety in biodiversity. And I want people to really start looking at relationships as an ecosystem where there's a unity of differences and not necessarily like uniformity where we have to think the same or be the same gender or have the same thoughts, and realize that together we're better together
100%.
and we can thrive more together, especially if we have that vision of what we want for ourselves and that love that we want to pour into the world. And again, I don't want to get the little masculine, the little feminine. Like, I really believe in like the bigger versions of masculinity and femininity. Like, if you look at the electromagnetic field, there's a positive and a negative pole, or a battery has a feminine and a negative charge, the sun and the moon. There are different and bigger levels of like masculinity and femininity, but together they thrive. And there's unity in that diversity. And I think that is the message in a world that makes us feel so polarized and so different. And it's just important for us to like have that remembrance. And be able to start a new co-creation and a new narrative and a new story. And just realize, like, perhaps it's just the stories we've been told, and who has told us those stories.
Yeah.
What programming or virus has been implanted in us to make us feel this way? And of course, we've all had our stories about, you know, certain people that have individually hurt us. But it's not fair to have certain things towards the entire population because perhaps one person in that population did something that was unkind or unloving. And I think the way that we heal that is coming together and having these talks about unity and what that means, and ask ourselves the question, instead of fighting against each other, what are we fighting for?
Yeah.
And what direction do we want to go in? And for me as women, it's like, how do we radiate more like beauty into the world and love into the world, and have it not just be like the third dimensional beauty? Like, how do we radiate our hearts into the world and create that beauty in a world that needs it now more than ever?
And when you speak of that, that kind of takes us around full circle to the beginning where we talked about why we wanted to do this on 11/11. So I gave a very three-dimensional, male, visceral reason because of Veterans Day and Normandy, but on a little bit more of a feminine, say, spiritual plane, there's something really powerful about 11/11 that pops up a lot with us.
So 11/11, it's an angel number that, you know, I love to see it on the clock, like 11/11. It's also supposed to be. It's also supposed to be the divine portal of like sacred union of like the masculine and the feminine, where you look at like each 11 as like a pillar, like a four quadrant pillar of like the home, and creating that. So it was like a really like spiritual, metaphysical day, but then also Veterans Day, and, you know, honoring my father and the veterans you work with, and then all the veterans that have fought for something. So I think what we're fighting for is me more love and beauty, and helping women heal those wounds in order for them to receive and be the vessels of the love and the lifestyle that they desire, with more flow and ease, and not this old paradigm. And then if you wanted to speak to what your desire is for the men, or men and women.
And it helps hearing the feminine side. I think for all of us, it's just seeking to understand, you know, being more curious instead of thinking that you have it figured out. I know for me and for men, the men that I coach, the idea of developing a warrior gentleman, someone who has learned how to fight, to develop who they are, someone who has the courage to continue to be who they are in the face of fear. That's what courage is. Courage is doing the right thing, the thing that's in alignment with your values and your goals, in the face of fear, not in the absence of it. And then once you have established that, to be able to show up with some level of dignity, and pride. You know, I tell a lot of our guys to suit up.
Yeah.
Myself, as being an athlete and working with operators of all sorts, I'm used to, you know, wearing board shorts, fight shorts, and khaki pants with camo on for most of my day. But there's something that changes state-wise when you take all of that out and you put your suit on, right? And that comes right from the superhero nerd of me. Like I love comic books. I love Marvel and the whole Marvel movement of movies up until recently, but I think they're going to turn back around. I've loved those movies because I love the idea that what seems to be a normal human being can suit up and become extraordinary. He goes from being the guy at the desk, the guy at the job, the guy doing the mundane thing, and then all of a sudden he puts on his cape or he throws on his suit and he's something else. Right? And we look at that from normal to fighter, but we don't think about that from fighter to gentleman. We don't think about that guy showing that same intention, showing up for his relationships, showing up for his businesses, showing up for his finances. It's the things that I look at for men, that the things that they were intentional about were the things that thrived. Like a really successful man, when he got his money together, when he got his job together, when he became a better athlete, a better competitor, it was because he had intention in every step to become that. And every day he woke up going, am I closer to that or am I walking further away? Every single day. But I challenge these men to wake up and go, are you doing that in your relationships? Do you show up that same way in your relationship, or is that just purely on autopilot? Because anything on autopilot will be swept away with the current, like we talked about earlier.
Yeah.
Being able to do that skill bridge between the thing we talk about, this the way you do anything is the way you do everything, is the most bullshit statement I've ever heard, that everyone says and parrots like it's the gospel. And we know it's not true because we know very successful men who are horrible at their relationships. We know this. The truth is there's a skill bridge between the ability to become who they were in their profession and the way they could become in their relationships. But that bridge needs to be built. It is not automatic. They have the capacity, the capability, but they don't have the skill and the direction or the drive to treat that as intentional. And so that's been my mission, is like when I tell guys to suit up, like you already know how to suit up when you get on the mat and when you go to the boardroom. Like you need to suit up for the rest of your life. You need to show up that way. And putting on the suit is donning that new persona of yourself that embodies the warrior as a gentleman into the regular everyday life. That's my mission.
I love that.
Yeah. And this is part of our mission.
Yeah.
Have these conversations, have these he and she conversations with the symbols that we've created. We have our rose, my rose, which is also a symbol of beauty and strength. And when you spoke about the rose earlier.
Yeah. Rose has always been one of my favorite flowers. If they say the fragrance or the energy of a rose is one of the highest Hertz frequencies when you study frequencies, which is that of the heart chakra. But I also feel like it's very boundaried. Like you can't just handle a rose a certain way.
Right. You cannot. You try.
So it's a very boundaried, but I also, in that more spiritual realm, you know, to me, it's like the feminine form of Christ consciousness, like the crown of thorns. So really, even if you're not Christian, just embodying the divine feminine and seeing yourself as like the holy daughter, no matter what religion you believe in, that if we see ourselves as like the holy daughter, I think that you will have a certain level of like cherishing yourself that will resonate into the world. And just to realize that like you were divinely created is very special to me. So to me, it's just a symbol of like being the holy daughter.
I love that.
And yeah.
And then we have the dagger. I've always loved knives.
Yes.
We're around people who are fascinated by knives, and there's so much to be said about, like, a fighting blade.
Mm-hmm.
So in our world, we make a distinction between a blade that's used for utility
Mm-hmm.
and a blade that's used for war.
Mm-hmm.
You never use your war blade for utility. You never use that blade to cut wood, to cut rope, do chores, to pop open cans. Like, this blade is sacred.
Mm-hmm.
It has been honed and sharpened and made beautiful as a result of the process, that very specific process of heating and folding and heating and folding and cooling to make the perfect blade to cut through anything.
Mm-hmm.
Like, this wasn't something that just popped up. This had to be forged
Mm-hmm.
like a good man.
Yeah.
Right? And then, just like a good man, once he has become this perfect blade, then it has to be cared to, and then there has to be used honorably. You know, great Jordan Peterson talked about this. A good man is not a harmless man.
Mm-hmm.
A good man is a dangerous man who has that under voluntary control. And I know that caused controversy when it came out, but from training with good men, from being with people at the tip of the spear in both the operator world and in the cage and mixed martial arts, I know what is true about good men. In order to say that you are good, it has to be choice.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a virtue if it's not choice.
Mm-hmm.
And if you are a harmless man, then you are doing what we call fawning, right? I learned this term from you. It's something that we talk about in the self-defense world. Is you're not actually being kind. You're placating to the enemy to lower their guard, raise their ego so they don't hurt you. You're not actually being kind.
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of fear, right? A man who is strong and has turned himself into a blade and is willing to use this against tyranny and do anything possible, but then willingly pulls back on that and becomes soft with his wife and his kids and the people he cares about, that's true kindness, because he has the choice to be otherwise. And I always encourage men to become as dangerous as you possibly can. And then from that place, put on a suit.
Yeah.
And then show up and hold your baby.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Cry when a loved one dies. Right? Share your deepest thoughts and feelings with the person that's closest to you. Right? Embrace your friends, especially your men who are suffering because they don't think that you can go talk to one another when you have problems. Like, become that sword and then be willing to sheath it and then carry that into the world as an example. And, you know, both men and women step into that full force of masculine and feminine, whatever way you want to look at that.
Yeah.
I think we've become a powerful, unified force.
Yeah. And it sounds like a lot of that is emotional regulation.
Yeah. Yeah. The sharp end of the blade is that part of you that's dangerous. The ability to sheathe that is your ability to regulate your emotion, which is that part of you that will unsheath your sword in situations that are not conducive to the betterment of everybody around you, including yourself. Right? You have to be dangerous, but if you don't have that under control, if you don't have emotional regulation, you have that dragon inside of you that you can't pet and calm down. You know, I tell my clients all the time, like, we all have a dragon inside of us. We all do. Some people have a bigger dragon than others, right? A dragon can be a protector. If you're a dragon rider and you're a protector around your village, anything outside of that village that is attacking can burn. A dragon can also light a fire that can light up a home, warm a place. But that same dragon, unbridled, undisciplined, will burn everything down in this path, including everything that you love. And so it is paramount that that person who's dangerous learns how to regulate themselves. And they know how to do that when they go to sport, right? Like, if the angry fighter who gets too angry loses control, becomes a hot-headed, becomes emotional, exposes himself. Angry soldier operator just goes rushing into battle because he's mad, angry, or scared, makes himself an easy target. Well, it's the same thing when you step out into your regular everyday world. If you allow that part of you to take control over, then all that work that you did to become, you can lose in one day. You can lose in one angry moment.
Yeah.
And it is that discipline, that regulation of your emotions is probably the most important skill that any man can ever learn. And when he learns that, he dominates everything that he's around. It really does.
Yeah. Well said.
Well, this has been a great episode 1. Keep tuning in.
Yeah.
Have more exciting episodes to come. We appreciate all of your support over the years, and we are going to continue to keep bringing content from the Dagger
And the rest.
the and she conversations. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye.